morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by PYA, SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC for cybersecurity risks, how to use them, and who may need them. Before we get started with the webinar, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. As this event is for CPE credit, there are some additional steps that we will need to take in order to comply with NASPA requests. In accordance with NASPA, attendees will be provided 3 polling questions throughout today's webinar. Responses are documented electronically. Attendees must respond to these polling questions within the allotted time in order to receive CPE credit for this course. A post-event survey will also be provided for attendees to submit regarding their webinar experience. The polling questions and the post-event survey must be submitted for proof of participation today. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenter by typing a message into the question pane of the control panel. We'll collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's event if we have time. If not, our presenter will reach out to you directly. Now I'd like to welcome Diane Bennett with us today from FHA to kick things off. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Diane Bennett, and I'm the Director of Education here at the FHA. We are delighted to have the opportunity to partner with PYA in an effort to support our member hospitals. PYA is an inaugural financial underwriter of the FHA's Research and Education Foundation and a leading professional services firm providing expertise in healthcare, tax, management consulting, and audit and assurance. With that, I would like to introduce Mike Shamblin, Audit Principal at PYA. Mike?
Yes, thank you, Diane. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar today. We're going to talk about System and Organization Controls Reporting, or what's commonly referred to as the acronym SOC reporting. And I think it's fair to say that there tends to be quite a bit of confusion in the marketplace, even among some of those that are a little more familiar with SOC reporting, just around mostly the different types of SOC reports and the intended purpose of each type of SOC report, how to use them, who may need them. So I think our primary objective today is to really clear up some of that confusion. So we're going to really start at a pretty basic level and assume that some in our audience today maybe have pretty limited familiarity with SOC reporting, and so we'll at least start there, and I think throughout the process and certainly by the end we'll clear up any of that confusion. So for some on the webinar today that are in our audience, you may be more on the customer side or end user side, if you will, of a SOC report, and so it may be that you're already receiving some SOC reports from certain of your vendors. And I think it's fair to say that with outsourcing in general becoming more and more popular, that there's an increasing need for SOC reports. Clearly, you can choose to outsource a service to a third party, and that happens more and more every day. But clearly, you cannot outsource the risk along with that to that third party. So you clearly are taking on risk as a business entity to house data, patient data, I think for most of our audience here, but customer data for the market at large. So you may choose to share that data with a third party with the service they're providing, but when you make that decision, you cannot outsource that risk of sharing that data to the third party. And so SOC reporting can help you with monitoring the third parties that you work with and making sure that they're safe and secure to work with, and ultimately help you mitigate your own organization's risk. There may be some in the audience today that will also be listening from more of from a vendor standpoint. And so you may be thinking to yourself, if you haven't already been receiving a SOC report, SOC audit, you may be thinking, should I be? And so maybe you're part of a larger organization that maybe has a subsidiary somewhere that's providing some type of service where you're accessing data from multiple entities. Maybe you're housing that data or processing that data or providing some sort of a managed service. And so there could be a need for a SOC audit that maybe you haven't thought about before. And I would say it's fairly common for those who maybe find themselves on that vendor side and have never had a SOC audit before. Normally the way that it starts getting on their radar is maybe they start being asked questions from their customers or end users, questions like, do you have written IT policies you could share with me? I'd like to have those to look over and maybe keep a copy of. Or they may get a question like, how do you secure my information as your customer that I provide to you? Or a question may be, would you notify me if your system was breached and my information as a customer and end user of your services was compromised in any way? So if you're a vendor to others where you're accessing data and you start getting those types of questions from your customers, that may be an indication that maybe a much more efficient way to answer those types of questions would be to consider having a SOC audit and share that report rather than trying to provide all that information by individual customers. So with that kind of a little bit of a kickoff to the subject matter, let's take a look at our overview for the day. And we're going to cover a few areas. I think it would make sense for us to start off and talk a little bit about the history of SOC reporting. So we're going to look at the origins of how this all came about, where it started, and how it's evolved over the years. And I feel like for us to really get into some more detail talking about the different types of SOC reports that will help to have that kind of a foundation in the history of SOC reporting. But then we'll move pretty quickly into the various types of SOC reporting. And so I'm going to go ahead and start throwing some acronyms at you and say that we'll talk about a SOC 1 report, a SOC 2 report. We'll talk about the fact that there's also something called a Type 1 and a Type 2 when it comes to both the SOC 1 and SOC 2. So if it's already starting to sound confusing, don't be worried, because we're going to go into each of those in great detail, and I promise you that you'll have a good understanding of what the differences are between those SOC types when we get to the end. And then next, we're going to talk about the anatomy of a SOC report. So let's say, for example, that we have someone listening today that is on the customer end user side of a SOC report. And let's say that maybe you're working with multiple entities where you're sharing your data with them. And so you may be receiving 3 or 4 or 5 different SOC reports from various vendors. So there are some things about a SOC report that tend to be consistent from report to report. So we're going to make sure you understand the anatomy of a SOC report to make you a more educated user of those SOC reports so that you can maybe go directly to information that would most benefit your organization when you're looking at those SOC reports. So we'll spend some time there. We'll also talk about the fact that there's a SOC 3 report. We'll compare and contrast that to the SOC 1 and SOC 2 as well. And then we're going to talk about a more newly created cybersecurity SOC that's only been around for a couple of years, and we're going to talk about where that fits in the whole SOC reporting equation. And then we've prepared just a few frequently asked questions that we receive from our clients. So we'll cover those. Hopefully those will be helpful, and we'll see certainly if there are any questions from the audience at that time, and we'll try to cover those today. And if not today, then I'll certainly follow up and make sure all questions get answered. So with that kind of an overview, let's jump right in. And as we mentioned, we're going to start off talking about the history of SOC reporting. And I think to really start in with the history, what would make sense would be to first talk about where is this guidance coming from? Who's the standard setting body for SOC reporting guidance? And so just to tell you, that is the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, or the AICPA. And I suspect that probably most people in our audience today are somewhat familiar with the AICPA, but just in case you're not, the AICPA is the group that establishes auditing standards for financial statement audits. So some people don't realize that only CPA firms can issue a SOC report. So that doesn't necessarily mean that every CPA firm offers SOC reporting services. In fact, I would say that most CPA firms don't offer SOC reporting services. It's not that different when you think about it from financial statement audits. I think there are somewhere around 44,000 CPA firms in the U.S., and many of those 44,000 firms don't offer financial statement audits. There are definitely a number of firms that would only offer tax services, for example. Some of those firms just choose not to invest in the resources that would be necessary to even offer financial statement audits and subject maybe their firm to peer review and things like that. So even a fewer number of CPA firms would choose to offer SOC reporting services. Clearly, it's a more unique skill set, a very focused skill set that's needed, and so not every firm, again, chooses to invest in those types of resources. So even though you don't have to be a CPA, that you do have to be a CPA firm to offer SOC services, not all CPA firms are going to offer SOC services. At the same time, there may be some boutique IT consulting firms, for example, that may arguably have a skill set to do some of the type of SOC testing, but because they're not a CPA firm, they would not be able to issue a SOC report. So just wanted to again, give you some background on who the standard setter body is through the AICPA that's creating the guidance that we have for SOC reporting. So with that, going back to 1992, the AICPA issued a Statement on Auditing Standard number 70, which created a new type of report that was designed for organizations to demonstrate testing of internal controls over financial reporting. So I want to key on two things I just said there. The first is that first statement, the SAS 70 statement, was housed in the auditing standards from the AICPA, where all of the guidance for financial statement audits is housed. So when I said Statement on Auditing Standard, or SAS, that literally was in the auditing guidance that governed all of the financial statement audit guidance as well. The second thing to key on there is that this was an audit that was originally focused solely on internal controls over financial reporting. And so that term, internal controls over financial reporting, is a very specific term, and it gets used frequently throughout the auditing guidance, both from the AICPA and also from the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, or the PCAOB, that was created during the Enron time and everything that came about with the creation of Sarbanes-Oxley. And so where most people are familiar with that term is SEC registrant companies are required to have a separate type of audit, separate from their financial statement audit, that would be an audit focused on internal controls over financial reporting, and that a lot of times is referred to as a SOX audit, SOX. So it just kind of coincidentally makes it even more confusing that SOX kind of sounds like SOC, what we're talking about today, SOC, SOC, and you have two different types of audits that connect back to this term, internal controls over financial reporting, but in different ways. And so that just adds to the confusion. So this SAS 70 report, again, was focused on a new type of audit back in 1992 that was focused on internal controls over financial reporting. And so when we talk about, okay, what does that really mean to say internal controls over financial reporting? Well, think about all the controls that have to work and work well as transactions flow through the accounting function and ultimately report up into the financial statements of an organization. So clearly, when we think about those types of controls, some of those controls may touch on the safety and security of data, but certainly wouldn't be the focus of that type of an audit. And so, again, we've got the creation now in 1992 of this new type of an audit called a SAS 70, focused on internal controls over financial reporting. But what started to happen about that time was there was a need in the market that was not being met. And the need was that vendors wanted a way to be able to demonstrate back to their customer end users that they were safe and secure to work with. And they really didn't have an efficient means of doing that. They probably were getting some of those questions that I went over when we were kicking off our presentation today. Probably customers were starting to say, can I see your IT policies and procedures? How can you assure me that you're safe to work with, and that if there's a breach, you're going to notify me. They were getting those questions for each customer. So vendors looked at this new SAS 70 report that had been created at that time and said, maybe there's a way we can make this report fit our need that's not being met. So what happened was vendors started working with audit firms to essentially take that SAS 70 report and modify it beyond its intended purpose to start meeting this need to demonstrate back to their customer end users that they were safe and secure to work with. So eventually, the AICPA figured out that that's what was happening, and they decided to create a more specific type of engagement and report, and essentially multiple types of engagements and reports that would more adequately meet both of those needs. So in 2010, the AICPA issued a Statement on Standards for Attestation Engagements, number 16, to replace the SAS 70 standard that had been issued. And so one thing to key on there is that not only did the AICPA recognize this issue and deficiency in the SAS 70 guidance, but when they created the new standard, this SSAE 16, it was no longer in the audit guidance. It was now in the attestation guidance. And so this may be a nerdy technical point, but I think it is kind of interesting to see that the AICPA recognized that this probably didn't belong in the audit guidance along with all the other guidance for financial audits. It probably belonged more in the attest guidance, where you certainly had more guidance around non-financial attestation services. So again, in 2010 now, we have the creation of this new SSAE 16. So it did a couple of things. SSAE 16 replaced the original intended purpose of the SAS 70 report, which had to do with those internal controls over financial reporting, in creating a SOC 1 report. And then it also created a SOC 2 report, which was to accomplish the need where vendors had modified that SAS 70 to demonstrate they were safe and secure to work with. So now we had a SOC 2 to accomplish that second objective. So again, we're going to go into more detail on the SOC 1 and SOC 2. This is just kind of bear with me for now as part of our history to get to the launching off point to talk about SOC 1 and SOC 2 in more detail. Then in 2017, the AICPA issued SSAE 18, which superseded SSAE 16. And this change flew a little more below the radar, if you will. It wasn't as significant as the issuance of SSAE 16, but also I think one reason it flew below the radar is that previously this audit had been linked to the standard itself. So the common terminology in the marketplace was to say, I need a SAS 70 audit, or can I get a copy of your SAS 70 audit? When SSAE 16 came out, the terminology was more widely adopted to replace SAS 70 audit with a SOC 1 audit or a SOC 2 audit. So no one really ever got accustomed to saying, I need an SSAE 16 audit, or can I have your SSAE 16 audit? It didn't just roll right off the tongue like SOC 1 or SOC 2 did. So we didn't have to change our terminology from we need an SSAE 16 audit to now I need an SSAE 18 audit. We still have a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 under both of those standards. So that's a little bit about the history of really where we've evolved to now, where we have the SOC 1 and the SOC 2 under SSAE 18. So with that history lesson, let's move on. And we're actually going to stop here for our first polling question.
Okay, the first polling question is, the SOC under SSAE 16 replace the old SAS 70 report. Please select one, true or false. Remember, you must fill out the polling questions in order to receive CPE credit. You will have 30 seconds to answer. Thank you for participating in our poll. Now I'll hand it back over to Mike.
All right, thank you. And by the way, I think everybody's aware of this, but your ability to obtain CPE today does not have anything to do with getting the polling questions correct. You just need to participate in answering those polling questions. So just want to make sure that everyone was aware of that. So now we're going to move into talking about first the SOC 1 report. And so just to recap quickly from our history lesson we were just talking about, the original intended purpose of the SAS 70, if you'll recall, was to focus on these audits of internal controls over financial reporting. And so that's essentially what the SOC 1 was created to do, was to replace the original intended purpose of the SAS 70. So now we have a SOC 1 that allows us to have an audit of an entity focused on their internal controls over financial reporting. So perhaps it's easy to think about an example where maybe you've got, let's say, organization A is serving organization B, and the internal controls over financial reporting of organization A will impact the financial reporting of organization B. So in that type of a situation, organization B may want to obtain a SOC 1 for organization A. I will say the SOC 1 is a less popular type of report than the SOC 2 that was created to essentially replace the modified use of the SAS 70 report. So for that reason, the SAS 70 term really was more akin, if you will, to the type of report where a vendor was demonstrating they were safe and secure to work with, rather than this audit focused on internal controls over financial reporting. But regardless, there is the SOC 1 now that meets that intended original need of the SAS 70. So let's move now and talk about the SOC 2 report. So again, we just said the SOC 2 was created as part of SSAE 16 to replace not the original intended purpose of the SAS 70, but to replace what it was being used for by many vendors to demonstrate they were safe and secure to work with. So vendors that are managed service providers or data processors, maybe data hosting organizations. You could include payroll processors or even investment trustees or custodians. There are lots of different types of organizations that may be accessing the data of their customers and ultimate end users to be able to provide a service. So those are all organizations that may have a need for a SOC 2 report. I would say it's pretty common for us at PYA to get phone calls from companies that may say, hey, I'm starting to be asked by my customer end users if I can share some of my internal information security policies, or they're asking me how I would handle a breach in their system. And then maybe at some point a customer calls and says, do you have a SOC 2 report you can share with me? And if that vendor has never had a SOC 2 report before and doesn't know a lot about SOC reporting, probably the first thing they're going to do is what most of us do these days when we are asked or hear about something we don't know a lot about, and that's do a Google search. So they may Google SOC reporting or Google CPA firms that provide SOC reporting, and so they may find a firm like a PYA and call and say, can you explain to me what I really need here? I think I need a SOC report. What type of SOC report do I need? This is what I'm trying to accomplish. And so probably at that point, they're feeling a lot of pressure and anxiety because maybe the customer has said, hey, if you want to continue to work with me, we're going to have this SOC report. And in many cases, the customer may have waited until they were in a bit of a pinch to ask for it. So they may be saying, we'd like it next week, or can you get it to me, in a few days? So now the company's vendors feeling a lot of pressure to get this done and get it done fast. And I would say with the uptick in outsourcing arrangements just in general, more and more people are outsourcing services. It's really increased the need for SOC reporting. And so there are people that have maybe not needed SOC 2 reports in the past that now are finding themselves in a situation where they need a SOC 2 report. So I know we probably have some vendors in the audience today, but I think it's fair to say that we probably have more customers or end users of these SOC reports than we do vendors. So probably as a customer end user, you have relationships, I would say many of you, with multiple vendors that you're allowing access to your data, and maybe in some cases even very sensitive data. And so hopefully many of you are already in the practice of periodically, hopefully maybe at least annually, assessing the risk of continuing to work with your vendors. And so hopefully, again, part of that process would be determining whether they have a SOC 2 report to share with you. I would say that if you, let's say, for example, are in the audience today and you have maybe 2 or 3 or so vendors that you're already receiving SOC 2 reports from, that a good exercise would maybe be to sit down and really think through, are there other vendors that you're allowing to access your data beyond those 2 or 3? If so, perhaps maybe you have another 2 or 3 vendors you need to be asking if they can provide a SOC 2 report to you. So that's just a good exercise to go through periodically and really think through, how many vendors are we sharing data with? One of the things that SOC 2 did, in addition just to creating this new type of report specific for vendors to demonstrate back how they are safe and secure to work with, is SOC 2 also created 5 trust services principles that are utilized in a SOC 2 report. And before we walk through those 5 trust services principles, I think it's important to point out that a vendor does not have to have all 5 trust services principles covered in a SOC 2 report. They can actually pick and choose which of the 5 trust services principles they would like to have included in their SOC 2 report. So with that being said, let's talk about what those 5 trust services principles are. So the first of those is the security principle. And this is the principle that addresses whether the system is protected against unauthorized access. And then the second trust principle is availability. So in other words, is the system available for operation and use as committed or agreed upon? The third trust principle is processing integrity. This is the principle that covers whether the system processing is complete, valid, accurate, timely, and authorized. The fourth trust principle is confidentiality. This is the principle that looks to see that information designated as confidential is protected as committed and agreed upon. Then the fifth and last trust principle is privacy. This is the trust principle that includes testing to see that all personal information is collected, used, retained, disclosed, and destroyed in accordance with the privacy notice requirements. So now that we've explained, well, we've covered the history of SOC reporting, and now hopefully everyone has a much better understanding of a SOC 1 versus a SOC 2, let's move in now and talk a little bit about the fact that there's what's called a Type 1 and a Type 2 report. And both the SOC 1 and the SOC 2 that we've talked about thus far each have a Type 1 and a Type 2 option. So I think that's clear, but just for example, you could have a SOC 1 Type 1, or you could have a SOC 1 Type 2, and that would be the way to refer to it from a terminology standpoint. Or you could also have a SOC 2 Type 1 or a SOC 2 Type 2. And so we're going to talk about what those modifiers in the Type 1 and Type 2 do to those reports. And we're primarily going to focus on it from a SOC 2 report, just because I think most people participating in the webinar today probably are more likely to use a SOC 2 than a SOC 1 report. So let's talk about then some of the unique attributes of the Type 1 and Type 2 reports. So we'll start with the Type 1. The Type 1 report is focused on the design of controls and does not provide for testing of the operating effectiveness of controls. So, for example, let's say that we have a SOC 2 Type 1 report. And let's say that as part of that testing, the auditor was looking at the control that has to do with when an employee is terminated and leaves an organization, and that employee previously had access to some of the critical systems containing sensitive data, that the auditor was looking to see that there was a process in place to make sure that that employee's access was also terminated to those critical systems. So in other words, we would have in a Type 1 report, the auditor looking to see that, let's say, for example, that there's a policy that says that as soon as human resources terminates an employee, the HR function notifies the Chief Information Technology Officer that an employee has been terminated and that their system access now needs to be terminated as well. And then the policy goes on to say that the Chief Information Technology Officer would terminate the access immediately upon being notified by the Human Resources Department. So let's say in our example, that's the policy. In a Type 1 report, the auditor may stop there or may supplement looking at the policy with an interview and just asking the Chief Information Technology Officer and perhaps someone in HR to explain how that control is designed. And so they may give a supplemental explanation in addition to what's in the policy. But at that point, the auditor has tested the design of that control. But they've clearly stopped short of selecting a sample of recent employees that may have been terminated to look back and see that, in fact, that control was executed properly and operated properly. And so that is not required in a Type 1 audit. All right, so let's contrast that with a Type 2 report. The Type 2 report also looks at the design of controls, but it's going to include testing of the operating effectiveness of those controls. So in my previous example, in a Type 2 audit, the auditor is also going to look at the policy and procedural document. They may also interview someone in HR and the Chief Information Technology Officer to confirm the design of that control. But the important part is, in a Type 2, the auditor is going to be required to also test the operating effectiveness of that control. So they're probably going to select a sample of recently terminated employees that had access to the system to see that, in fact, that Chief Information Technology Officer did terminate access for that employee, and there were hopefully no exceptions to that control working effectively. So that is the big difference between a Type 1 and a Type 2. Not the only difference, but one of the big differences. Another significant difference between a Type 1 and Type 2 report is the timing of the report, the period of time covered in the report. A Type 1 report is going to be as of a point in time. So think of it as a snapshot in time, much like, for maybe any accountants on the call, much like a balance sheet would be a snapshot in time. So in other words, a Type 1 SOC 2 report would be telling you that as of this particular day, the controls were designed correctly. Again, going back to our first distinction of a Type 1 report. Whereas in a Type 2 SOC report, it's going to cover a period of time, not just a particular snapshot in time. It's typically going to be a 6 to 12 month period of time. So think of it more like an income statement for the accountants maybe out there. That's a good analogy. So in other words, the auditor is saying in their opinion to you that the controls were designed correctly and were operating effectively over this period of time, a 6 to 12 month period of time. So again, just to recap quickly, the big differences between Type 1 and Type 2 is Type 1 only covers the design of controls, does not test for operating effectiveness, and it's just as of a point in time, a snapshot. A Type 2 report, on the other hand, covers not just the design of controls, but also covers testing of operating effectiveness over a period of time, typically 6 to 12 months. So clearly, with that understanding, a Type 2 report is going to provide a higher level of assurance than a Type 1 report. And so I would say it's been fairly common for me in my role for the firm to see our clients at times obtain a SOC report from one of their vendors and really not have an appreciation for the difference between the between the Type 1 and Type 2. So sometimes our clients have viewed it as well, I got a SOC report period, almost as if all SOC reports were created equal. and not having really an appreciation for that distinction between the type 1 and type 2. So now that you know this and you understand the differences, certainly you would have every right as a customer and end user for one of your vendors if you see that they are only providing you a type 1 report and you feel like you're sharing very critical data with them and it's very important to you to have the highest level of assurance that they're protecting that data and they continue to be safe and secure to work with, you would have every right to make a request of, I'd really like to see you having a type 2 SOC 2 report performed each year rather than a type 1 report. So just know you would have that right to ask that question. So with that, let's move on to our second polling question.
Thank you. The second polling question is, a SOC 2 Type 2 SOC report would express an opinion on the design and operating effectiveness of controls. True or false? Remember, you must fill out the polling question in order to receive CPE credit. You will have 30 seconds to answer. Thank you for participating in our poll. Now I'll hand it back over to Mike.
Okay, so now we're going to move into talking about the anatomy of the SOC report. I mentioned earlier, I think many people on the phone today are likely customers, end users, and it's very likely that they're working with more than one vendor, maybe in some cases multiple vendors where they're receiving SOC reports. And so you may be obtaining those for a couple of different reasons. You may be obtaining them as part of your vendor risk assessment process. You may also be going through an audit yourself, maybe a financial statement audit where your financial statement auditor is asking to see if you've obtained SOC reports from some of your vendors. So we're going to help you with this section understand what should you be looking for in each of these SOC reports, what will be consistent from SOC report to SOC report, so you'll be a more educated user of these SOC reports. So the first section of most SOC 2 reports is going to be the opinion report from the auditor. So much like a financial statement audit, the auditor is going to be expressing an opinion. That may be a clean opinion or what would also be called an unmodified opinion, or the opinion could be modified in some way. It could actually be a qualified opinion or an adverse opinion, or there could be some disclaimer of opinion on all or just a part of the testing. So it's really important as a user of the SOC report to actually read the opinion. I will admit that I have seen some of our clients obtain a SOC report from a vendor, and they've essentially checked a box on a form kind of saying that they did receive a SOC report, but then they kind of stopped there and didn't really take the time to read through the SOC report. And so in one case, I know there was a situation where someone had checked a box and essentially concluded that a particular vendor was still safe and secure to work with, but when I read the SOC report, it was actually not a clean opinion, and there were some pretty significant exceptions that were found in the audit itself, and they weren't aware of that. They hadn't taken the time to actually read through the SOC report. So don't let yourself get caught in that sort of a trap. Don't just glance at the cover and see that it is a SOC report and looks like the proper thickness or proper number of pages. If you're looking at an electronic version, take the time to actually read through the SOC report, especially that auditor opinion, to make a determination, is it a clean opinion or not. The second section of a SOC report is typically going to be the written assertion from management. So you'll remember there were those 5 trust services principles in a SOC 2 report, and so management of the company being audited, the vendor, is going to tell you here in this assertion which of those trust principles that they are subjecting to the audit, and they're going to assert that their system of controls is working well with respect to one or more of those trust principles that they're including. So that is definitely a good thing to read as well as you're reading the opinion, as those two kind of go hand in hand. The next section of a SOC report is probably going to be one of the meatiest sections of the SOC report, and that is going to be the service organization's description of their system of controls. And so think of this maybe like the Cliff Notes version of their policies and procedures over information security. So if you'd like an opportunity to peer behind the curtain or see how the sausage is made, or pick your metaphor, to see how things are actually happening at your vendor, this is really going to be your best opportunity to do that through reading this particular section. So hopefully after you read this section, you'll feel like you're more knowledgeable with respect to your vendor's control system. The next section is not always applicable, but when it is, it's important to read as a customer end user. And this is a section on complementary user entity controls. Essentially, this is the vendor saying, if you're going to rely on my system of controls, then as best practice, you must have these complementary controls in place at your own organization to achieve the ultimate control objectives. So if you're a customer end user and you haven't taken the time to read through to see if there are any of those complementary end user controls, you definitely should do that to make sure that you're not overlooking maybe a particular control you need to have in place at your own organization. And then the last section of a SOC report is going to be the summary detail of the tests that were actually performed by the auditor. And this is typically a matrix format where you'll see a listing of all the tests that were performed, grouped by category of trust principle, and then the results of performing that test. And it's certainly very possible that even in a situation where an organization received a clean opinion as part of their audit, there may still be some exceptions that are noted in the details of this testing. So it's worth a read. You may see a particular control that had some exceptions listed, and again, you would have every right as a customer end user to ask your vendor, I see that you did receive a clean report, but along with that, I saw you had an exception on this particular test, and can you tell me what you're doing in the future to correct that and remedy that deficiency so that you don't have that exception in the future? So just know you can be an educated user of these by asking those types of questions. So now that we've covered the anatomy of the SOC report, let's move on, and we're going to cover this next one pretty quickly, but I did want you to be aware that there is also what's called a SOC 3 report. It's very similar to a SOC 2 report, but the differences are it's typically intended to be for much wider distribution. Think of use like marketing collateral. So it's not going to include as much detail as a SOC 2 report. It's not going to include that description of the system of controls, and it's not going to include all the detail of the testing from the auditor, but it is something that, whereas a SOC 2 is just going to be limited to distribution to your actual customers and end users, a SOC 3 really could be distributed to just about anyone, like marketing collateral would be. So that's the primary difference between a SOC 3 and a SOC 2. Just wanted everybody to at least be aware of that in case you hear that term and think, well, gosh, we didn't even touch on a SOC 3 in that webinar. So next, we're going to talk about, I mentioned earlier, kind of a newly created cybersecurity SOC. And if you're like me and you read just different business magazines, you see these surveys where someone has surveyed maybe a group of corporate CEOs. Certainly a lot of the surveys I've read include CEOs of health systems and hospitals, and you read in these surveys, what's the number one thing, or what are the primary things that keep you up at night, or what are the primary risks that you just can't sleep at night because you're thinking about. And over the last few years, it's really evolved to where I think cybersecurity risk is pretty commonly the number one, if not a close second answer in most of those surveys. So everyone is very concerned about cybersecurity risk, and it's really across pretty much all industries now. So organizations are feeling this increasing pressure to demonstrate that they're managing cybersecurity threats and that they have effective processes and controls in place to detect, respond to, mitigate, and recover from breaches and other security events. So to address this market need, the AICPA has developed a cybersecurity risk management reporting framework that assists organizations as they communicate relevant and useful information about the effectiveness of their cybersecurity risk management programs. So the framework is a key component of this new SOC for cybersecurity. So think about it as what the trust services principles were to the SOC 2 when SSAE 16 got created. This cybersecurity framework is to the SOC for cybersecurity. So this SOC for cybersecurity can help various stakeholders like senior management, board of directors, analysts, investors, and business partners gain a better understanding of an organization's efforts to mitigate cybersecurity risk. So I mentioned this was a couple of years old. So back, it was in 2017 when the AICPA actually created this cybersecurity framework. And while it's really just considered a best practice at this point, used primarily by entities wanting to demonstrate that they're ahead of the curve when it comes to cybersecurity preparedness, I think it's really anticipated that this new type of cybersecurity SOC will become the standard in the not too distant future, especially as more and more states mandate cybersecurity preparedness laws. So again, a little less common to see still in the marketplace than the SOC 2, but I think we'll see a growing demand for this fairly new cybersecurity SOC in the future. With that, let's move into our third and final polling question.
Thank you. The third polling question is, a Type 1 SOC report is as of a point in time, whereas a Type 2 SOC report covers a period of time. Please select one, true or false. Remember, you must fill out the polling questions in order to receive CPE credit. You will have 30 seconds to answer. Thank you for participating in our poll. Now I'll hand it back over to Mike.
Thank you. So we've got a few minutes left together, and I had wanted to save time to maybe share with you just a few of the frequently asked questions that we receive at PYA from our clients and prospective clients about SOC reporting. So I've got just a few questions. If we have time, hopefully we can get through each of these, and then we'll see what other questions we may have from the audience. So the first question that's a frequently asked question for us relates to organizations that may be going through a SOC audit for the very first time. So the question is typically around what an organization needs to do to prepare for a SOC audit. So if they've never gone through one before, they feel sometimes a little bit lost as where to start. And so we typically have a few different suggestions for someone that's going through a SOC audit for the very first time. And again, we're going to focus a little more on a SOC 2 audit as being the most common type of SOC audit that we see a need for. So if we have someone going through a SOC 2 audit for the very first time, we're going to encourage them to first read through those 5 trust services principles and really just read all 5, getting an understanding of what each of those is going to include and cover, and be thinking about as they read, do they have already controls and processes in place that are going to address each of those trust services principles? And then as part of doing that, they can then also formulate their decision around which of those trust principles they're going to include in their testing, because you'll recall we said earlier, they're not mandated to include all 5. They can pick and choose which of those 5 they would like to include in their testing. The second thing we're going to encourage them to do is to go ahead and write out their description of their system of controls. You'll remember when we talked about the anatomy of a SOC report that that's going to be one of the required components of the report anyway. And so to take the time to write out their description of system of controls is going to put them through the exercise of really thinking through and kind of matching up to those trust services principles, how their system of controls is working. And sometimes through going through that exercise of actually putting it down on paper, it can highlight for them areas where they maybe have gaps that they need to fill. So that's definitely an important part. Another suggestion we make is to consider actually having a third party, and it may even be the same audit firm that's going to perform the audit for them ultimately, but to consider having a third party perform a gap assessment before they launch into their first SOC audit. The idea behind this would be that it's certainly much better to find out you have deficiencies through a gap assessment that need to be addressed rather than just going straight into an audit only to find out that you're going to have to receive an adverse opinion of some sort or a modified opinion of some sort because you are lacking in some of your controls in a particular area. So taking the time to maybe have an objective, independent third party, knowledgeable third party perform that gap assessment is a good suggestion. And then even if you can't or choose not to have a third party perform a gap assessment, I think at a minimum then performing a gap self-assessment would be important. You may not be as objective, obviously looking at yourself, and maybe not even as knowledgeable as what a third party expert would be, but it certainly couldn't hurt to perform a self-assessment and see if you see any gaps before launching into your first audit. So those would be some of the suggestions we would have for someone going through a SOC audit for the very first time. Another frequently asked question that we receive is from organizations that may be interested in having testing done related to other IT frameworks that exist in the marketplace. So in other words, they may want to have a SOC 2 report done, but in addition to those trust services principles, they may be interested in including other frameworks. A couple that are most common for us to see are a framework that's called NIST, which stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or maybe the High Trust framework, which is a very common IT framework in the healthcare setting. And so it is acceptable to layer in one or more of these other frameworks in a SOC 2 audit, in addition to those trust services principles. And at PYA, for example, we have a proprietary crosswalk we've created that identifies and reconciles any overlap between those various frameworks and the trust services principles, and then also highlights any differences between those frameworks so that we eliminate any duplication of effort, if you will. We're not testing the same control twice or more times under each framework. One thing to keep in mind, if you are a healthcare organization and interested in having a SOC 2 and layering in high trust, we talked about the limiting factor earlier, the fact that only CPA firms can issue SOC reports. Firms have to be high trust certified to issue a high trust report. So to receive a SOC 2 with a layer in of high trust principles, you would have to choose a CPA firm, but also a CPA firm that is high trust certified. So they just want to point that out. That would be important for you to seek out that type of specialized firm. Another frequently asked question that we receive is, usually this is more from the customer end user side, but they may say, I'm being asked for a SOC audit as part of maybe a financial statement audit I'm going through, and I've looked, and the last SOC report that my vendor gave me was prior to my year end, and I've contacted them and they don't have a new SOC report yet. My auditor is asking for a more recent SOC report. What should I do? And many times in that situations, there can be that gap, if you will, between the timing of maybe when your vendor had their last SOC audit and when you're trying to audit through for your purposes. And so there can be this gap period. And what we see is that there's a concept of what's called a bridge letter that can be issued. And the bridge letter is a letter that typically comes from the vendor company to their customer end users, just indicating that the controls have not changed, or if they have, that would need to be addressed in the bridge letter. But normally the letter is indicating that the controls have not changed from their most recent SOC audit, and that they're not aware of any concerns that the end users would need to have because of a lack of change of control. So if the most recent SOC report is not meeting your need, you might ask your vendor for a bridge letter. So those were some of the more frequently asked questions that we have, and so I just wanted to pause there to see if there are any other questions from the audience today. But if not, that completes our presentation today, and just wanted to again offer my thanks to everyone who participated in today's webinar.
Thanks to our presenter, Mike Shamblin. If you have any questions, his presentation and contact information will be emailed to you along with a recording of today's webinar. Also, if PYA can provide assistance with audit, tax, compliance, valuation, or physician services, please call or email us. You may also visit our website at pyapc.com for more details about our specific areas of expertise, or to subscribe to receive PYA insights. Please remember to stay on the line once the webinar disconnects to complete a short survey for CPE credit. On behalf of PYA and FHA, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.